You've probably heard the story of Job, right? The righteous man who loses absolutely everything and has to argue with his friends and even God about why it's all happening. It's a story that tackles one of the biggest questions we ever ask. It's a question that's just timeless and, honestly, gut-wrenching. But here's the really fascinating part. The author of the book of Job wasn't the first person to ask it, not by a long shot. It turns out the story of Job was actually jumping into a conversation that was already ancient, a deep, sprawling debate that had been going on across the ancient world for centuries before the book was even put to paper. So, to really get where Job is coming from, we need to zoom out and look at a whole category of ancient writing. This wasn't just about telling cool stories. This was the ancient world's way of grappling with life's hardest problems. They called this stuff wisdom literature, and you can think of it as the philosophical TED Talks of the ancient Near East. It was this whole genre where thinkers and scribes wrestled with the very same things that keep us up at night. Why is there pain? Is there any real justice? And where do the gods fit into all this mess? And you know what? The book of Job itself actually leaves us a clue. The story is set in the land of Uz, a place that the text makes clear is outside of Israel. That's not an accident. The author is basically giving us a wink, pointing us toward an older, wider tradition that formed the backdrop for this whole epic debate. And that clue points us straight to Mesopotamia, what we now call Iraq, where archaeologists have found these incredible texts that sound, well, a lot like the story of Job. Let's meet some of these other righteous sufferers. Okay, first up we have a Sumerian text. And get this, it's from before 2000 BCE. Let that sink in for a second. That's over 1,000 years before Job was likely written down. This is one of the earliest records we have of a human being putting their anguish into words. So in this poem, you've got this guy who is going through absolute agony, but he refuses to blame his God. Instead, he takes this humble approach, confessing any sin he might have committed without even knowing it. And right there, boom, you see the birth of this powerful literary idea, the righteous sufferer, who holds on to faith even when nothing makes sense. Now, let's jump forward a bit to a text that scholars have literally nicknamed the Babylonian Job. It's called Lidlil Bel Nemeqi, and the parallels here are just, wow. They're unavoidable. I mean, does this sound familiar? It starts with a super devout, important official who loses everything. His position, his money, his health, all of it, just gone. Then he cries out, lamenting how unfair it all is, just like Job does. And in the end, his god, Marduk, steps in and restores everything he lost. It's pretty much the same narrative arc. And the conversation didn't stop there. There's another incredible text called the Babylonian Theodicy. This one feels less like a personal story and more like a straight-up philosophical throwdown, and its structure is unbelievably similar to the middle of the book of Job. So what we have here is a back and forth between a man who's suffering and his friend, and they're arguing about the exact same problem. Why do bad people seem to get ahead? It mirrors the debates between Job and his friends almost perfectly, but, and this is a huge difference, unlike Job, who gets that dramatic answer from God out of the whirlwind, this Babylonian debate just ends. The questions are left hanging in the air, unresolved. When you lay it all out like this, you can really see how the idea evolved over time. You start with the early Sumerian text, which is a pretty simple lament and confession. Then, with Ludlil Bel Nemeqi, it becomes a full story with a satisfying divine restoration. And finally, the Babylonian Theodicy takes it to a whole new level of complexity with an unresolved debate. They were all tackling the same problem, just from completely different angles. So the big question is, how did all these Mesopotamian stories connect with the author of Job? Well, it's important to understand this wasn't about one author copying another. It was about being part of the same shared intellectual world. That's really the key. Think of it like a musician today who's influenced by a century of blues music. The author of Job was tapping into a conversation that was already centuries old. They inherited these questions and these story structures and then used them to create something totally new and, frankly, radical. This timeline just drives it home. You can see these literary traditions bubbling away in Mesopotamia for thousands of years before the book of Job shows up on the scene. The ideas were definitely in the air. So what was the historical moment that finally built a bridge between these two worlds? Well, the answer lies in one of the most painful and transformative events in all of Israelite history, the Babylonian exile. This is the moment where everything connects. So during this time, the smartest, most influential people from the kingdom of Judah were ripped from their homes and forced to live in Babylon. Just try to imagine that. You're suddenly immersed in this powerful foreign culture, and you're encountering these very stories about suffering and divine justice at the exact same time your own nation is in ashes, and you're asking on a massive scale, why did God let this happen to us? It was the perfect creative pressure cooker for a masterpiece like Job to be born. So what does this all mean for how we read Job today? Does finding out about its background make it any less powerful? Absolutely not. In fact, I think it does the exact opposite. And this is the most important takeaway. Understanding the conversation that Job was entering is what allows us to see how revolutionary it truly was. The author uses all the familiar pieces, the good guy who suffers, the friends with their easy answers, but then pushes the whole thing somewhere completely new. Job doesn't get a simple restoration, and he doesn't accept an unresolved debate. No, he demands an answer directly from God. That raw, face-to-face confrontation is what sets Job apart from everything that came before it. You see, that conversation that started in ancient Sumeria and Babylonia, it didn't end with the book of Job. It's still going on, in all of us. The ancient world offered its answers: confession, restoration, philosophical debate. Job offered its own, powerful, and unsettling answer. And so the question comes down to us. Today, when we face suffering, what are ours?